Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our participants from all over the world. Bienvenidos a todos y todas. My name is Ria Lagari. I'm UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice Consultant, and welcome to this webinar on gender trainers and COVID-19. What have we learned from the pandemic? So this is the first discussion we've had in 2021, and it's an online discussion, and we're going to discuss basically online learning and how gender trainers have fared in this last very difficult year. And so as you all know, whoever is familiar with virtual dialogues, they're mechanisms for us to discuss, exchange, and continually share learning. So our panel today, we're very lucky to be joined by four amazing panelists. We have Namdi Eseme, Dr. Daniela Moreno Alarcón, Adriana Greenblatt, and Alvaro Campos Guadamus. Can we go to the next slide, please? Sorry. You can see our panelists up here. And we're also very, very lucky to have with us today our wonderful moderator, Dr. Lucy Ferguson, who's consultant for the Training Center as well. And she will be moderating the panel. And you can participate, all of you who are taking part live. You can participate by using the question and answers features of Zoom that you have at the bottom. You can use that or the chat feature anytime. And just to remind you that the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the Training Center's YouTube channel. I'm going to hand over now to Lucy, who's going to talk you through our theme for today.
Muchas gracias, Ruya. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Thank you, Ruya. Welcome to everybody joining us from around the world. We're excited to have a bilingual panel today. So you'll be able to, we have two presentations in English and two in Spanish, and we have brief translations of the slides as well for those of you who don't speak the other language. We, as Ruya said, we know this has been a really challenging year for us as gender trainers, and we ran a session in July asking what does this mean for gender training, and I think that we've probably got a lot deeper and more interesting reflections to share now as well. So training delivery, of course, has been completely transformed. We're no longer able to travel to do in-person training, and also people are often in very difficult situations when they're attending or even delivering the training as well. We don't know yet exactly what the impact will be on budgets, but certainly it seems that it will be less easy to justify big budgets for in-person trainings when we're proving that it can be done so effectively online. So that's an interesting point. And also we are having to, as trainers, we've had to kind of adapt our skills very quickly and rapidly, and yet we haven't necessarily had the time to reflect properly on what that means for pedagogy, and maybe we haven't even changed our learning objectives and tools and methods. So it's really interesting to discuss these points today. We want to think about three main questions. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected gender trainers and training for gender equality? What lessons have we as gender trainers learned from the pandemic, and what recommendations do gender trainers have for the future of training for gender equality? We have four speakers with us today. Each speaker is going to speak for around 7 or 8 minutes, and there'll be time for you to discuss at the end. We're really happy to have with us Namdi Eseme as our first speaker today. You can see a Spanish translation of his slides at the bottom. Namdi is academic, gender expert, writer, facilitator, and a global voice in engaging men and voice to advance gender equality. He has many years of experience working across sub-Saharan Africa, especially in Nigeria and post-Ebola Sierra Leone, creating innovative solutions to pressing challenges affecting gender equality young women and girls. And his most recent efforts focus on addressing intimate partner violence among migrant women in Europe and studying the epidemiology behind gender in primary and transrural healthcare. So I am very happy to pass to you, Namdi, to start your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that wonderful introduction. So I'm just going to go right into it. As you can see from my slide, what are the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? Yeah, my slide is going to serve as a background for more deeper presentation by my colleagues, but just to highlight some of the issues we see, especially in this trying time, we see that there has been loss of jobs and increased care burden for women and girls. There have been also the prospect of rebalancing gender roles in terms of home care. So we haven't just seen negatives associated with gender training and the whole idea of gender, but we've also seen positives as this prospect of rebalancing gender roles can be seen in men who have to spend more time at home with their families and are beginning to visualize or see practically what women have to go through in addition to their work. But the pandemic has also truncated women-owned small and medium-scale enterprises. There have been increased risks to intimate partner violence and abuse, as we can all agree. There have been susceptibility to rape and exploitation, but particularly there have been near hopelessness for migrant women in several countries, as we can see from some of the trainings conducted in this time, that migrant women who are struggling with acculturation in the countries they are in still have to deal with the issue of gender egalitarianism, especially when they come from countries that this is not the same. So they struggle with all of that, and that makes them susceptible to exploitation and abuse by people who take advantage of them. There's also increased school dropout rates for women and girls, especially in developing countries, and a spike in harmful cultural practices underpinning female genital mutilation and child marriage. If you could go to the next slide, we would now focus mostly on the solution, but again, we cannot rule out the fact that mortality had also been seen in women as well. But for solution one, we would, from experience, say that we need to recognize the multiple ways in which COVID-19 affects women and their families. And this has to happen across all levels of government and across all levels of our facilitation or curricular as gender trainers. We need to recognize the multiple ways COVID-19 has affected all the gendered consequences of the pandemic intersect with other entrenched inequalities. And this is quite an important area to look at, because COVID-19, we would say, is new, and it is bringing up all of these issues that prior now we never saw coming in our work. I will just give a clear example of this. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that in the last 3 weeks, this is just a local media report from a Nigerian local newspaper. You can see that although it is quite traumatic, but it's becoming more prevalent that there is rape, there is defilement. A teenager had to speak up about the abuse, the sexual abuse by her father. And you can see the other girl in her 20s saying that her father had been abusing her for a really long time during the pandemic. So now we begin to see all of these issues coming up. And as gender trainers, we need to factor in some of these things into our curriculum to bring to the fore these issues. So we as gender trainers need to develop gender indicators specific to the issues identified and task relevant government bodies to track these indicators. Now, when none exists, when none such agencies exist, our recommendation should be that they are set up immediately, because we understand that not every country or not every agency of government has a gender focal person or take the issue of gender as seriously as they would. It's a work in progress, and it is our responsibility as gender facilitators to do everything we can to ensure that we bring these things to fore. On the next slide is our solution 3, which, although ignored before now or not taken seriously into consideration, there has to be robust engagement of gender experts and trainers to drive policies and intervention programs, mainstreaming gender during and post-COVID-19. So we see that before now, just a few organizations were beginning to highlight the importance of gender, trying to mainstream gender even in their organization. But right now, the pandemic has brought up so many issues that are related to gender, and there has to be that robust engagement of gender experts, of gender trainers, to see that there is increased education, increased sensitization, there is behavioral change, there is cultural transition, and there is the acceptance of a more gender-friendly society. So it is quite important that we take this seriously as a solution. And for the fourth solution, which is on the next slide, we have to work with the media, even as gender facilitators, not all work in silos, but work alongside the media to intentionally script key messages, highlighting the gendered impacts of the pandemic, as well as for public dissemination. But we must be careful as gender facilitators that whatever information or whatever enhancement we are making on our curricula should be validated by scientific evidence, or yes, by of course scientific evidence, or already practiced, already conducted surveys, just to give it that we do not cause panic whenever we do our trainings, and we do not put out information that we are not sure of, that rather than do good, it sort of backpedals on all the progress we have made so far. We also need to engage with other civil society organizations and non-state actors, particularly those that are residents in countries that have experienced an upsurge of an astronomical level in terms of gender-based violence and gender issues, to try and collectively address these things as a unit. That way we can have more impact when we talk about gender. On my final thoughts, because it's a really short time to make such a presentation, I would say the pandemic has taught us how significant our collective effort as gender trainers can be towards achieving gender equality. And if you would ask me what one thing we can do to ensure that we adapt to the changing situation, is that we need action, we need more action and sustained action. So I'm going to stop here and say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nandi. I've really enjoyed your presentation, and what a fantastic overview, and also kind of rallying call to us as gender trainers to engage with the broader context of what's going on. Thank you so much for that presentation. Our second presenter will be Daniela Moreno Aragon. She'll be speaking in Spanish, but you can see an English translation at the bottom of the slides on her screen. Daniela is a researcher, trainer, and consultant with over 11 years of experience, specifically focusing on gender mainstreaming in tourism development in Latin America and the Caribbean and globally. Daniela has collaborated with a range of organizations such as UN Women, UN World Tourism Organization, ITC ILO, ECLAC, International and Ibero-American Foundation for Administration and Public Policies, and UN Women in Cape Verde, Nepal, and Albania. Daniela, bienvenida, muchas gracias por estar con nosotras y nosotros, y te paso ahora la palabra.
Bueno, en primer lugar, muchas gracias por la invitación. Preparar esta presentación ha sido como una catarsis personal, porque llevo 1 año y medio haciendo formaciones online, y sobre todo muchas formaciones presenciales que tenía que hacer en algunas misiones se convirtieron de la noche a la mañana en formaciones online, entonces he podido ver estas brechas que hay. La siguiente, por favor. Respondiendo a la primera pregunta que está suscrita en este encuentro, me gustaría anunciar los siguientes puntos, por favor. Los siguientes puntos es, en primer lugar, cuando empezó esta pandemia hubo un cambio en la agenda de investigación de género a contrarreloj. Entonces todo el contenido, toda esa planificación conceptual y de contenido que teníamos muchas formadoras y formadores cambió de la noche a la mañana. Entonces esto realmente fue un desafío, es decir, readaptar los currículos formativos tan rápido fue totalmente un desafío que como académica también implicó mucho trabajo. Siguiendo con los puntos, luego otro tema es la teoría del cambio aplicada a la formación. Esta ha cambiado. ¿Qué me refiero a la teoría del cambio? Es esta dialéctica feminista que al menos yo uso mucho en mis formaciones, una dialéctica feminista que instaura el pensamiento reflexivo y transformativo, y que durante muchos años hemos visto que este contacto directo, casi muy de cara a cara, ayuda mucho a generar esta dialéctica feminista a través de la formación. Entonces, de alguna manera, todo este nuevo formato online ha cambiado como las reglas del juego. Entonces tenemos que hacer mucho esfuerzo para poder llegar a ese encuentro reflexivo y transformativo con el alumnado. Otro punto que para mí ha sido que ha afectado es el encontrar la identidad del alumnado, su motivación principal para querer hacer un curso, en este caso, de género. Para mí es muy importante encontrar la identidad del alumnado porque también me sirve para encontrar, por ejemplo, su motivación para ir contra las resistencias de género. Es decir, nosotras podemos ayudarles a instaurar un debate contra las resistencias, incluso hasta metodologías, pero un motivo principal, algo que realmente te mueva para ir contra las resistencias, yo creo que la distancia que tenemos ahora es realmente un desafío y ha afectado, desde mi punto de vista, la capacitación en género. Y lógicamente, yo creo que aquí todas y todos compartimos esto, hay una escasez ahora de metodología vivencial y participativa, esto es un desafío. Por mucho tiempo hemos estado acostumbradas a realizar una formación con muchos instrumentos participativos. El primero que se me viene a la cabeza, por ejemplo, es el teatro, el cambio de roles, que actualmente no lo podemos hacer, entonces tenemos que buscar las mejores maneras para llegar a ese punto reflexivo, que es lo que realmente promueve estos instrumentos participativos y vivenciales. La siguiente, por favor. Entonces, ¿qué hemos aprendido? En realidad, ¿qué he aprendido yo a lo largo de este tiempo? Siguiendo los puntos de la presentación, yo creo que las composiciones de los equipos de trabajo a la hora de diseñar, implementar y evaluar las formaciones, yo creo que han cambiado. Yo creo que ahora hay roles que a lo mejor antes no se necesitaban o que no tenían un protagonismo, y yo creo que ahora son muy importantes. Por ejemplo, el rol de una observadora. Yo ahora estoy involucrada en unas formaciones en la Universidad de Washington. Hay observadoras de cara incluso a la tecnología que se está usando para poder sacar una formación en género. Entonces hay roles que ahora están dentro de la composición de un diseño de una formación en temas de género. Tenemos menos cabida para la improvisación. A mí me gustaba mucho improvisar porque yo iba de acuerdo a lo que el alumnado te iba diciendo, ¿no? De alguna manera, aunque tengamos algunas pautas esenciales para hacer una formación. Pero ahora, claro, tenemos 90 minutos y de ahí no nos podemos salir, entonces la improvisación es muy compleja. Por tanto, para mí ahora es muy importante hacer un seguimiento del alumnado extra formación online presencial. Suelo tener one-to-one meeting con el alumnado, incluso tengo un guión de preguntas que se las hago después de la presentación en vivo, que a mí me está ayudando mucho a tener una formación más personalizada, es decir, lo online no significa que lo personalizado no vaya a existir. Y lo otro, esto es muy importante, casos de estudios que en lo presencial me resultaban muy bien, pero en lo online no funcionan bien. En lo online parecen casos incompletos, entonces yo he tenido que revisar y readaptar muchos casos de estudio para utilizarlos en formato online, porque realmente desempacar, unpack, como se dice en inglés, un caso de estudio online es mucho más complejo que hacerlo presencial. La siguiente, Lucy, por favor. Entonces, ¿cuáles son mis recomendaciones? Yo creo que lo mejor es grabar las sesiones y enviárselas al alumnado. Eso es lo que yo estoy haciendo y se las envío con esta pauta de preguntas que ya les dije anteriormente para tener una retroalimentación más rica y que se parezca un poco más a la que yo experimentaba cuando hacía las formaciones presenciales. Enfatizamos rondas de preguntas, hay los board of discussions también que son muy importantes, pero también cuesta mucho promover la discusión ahora online. Yo invierto mucho tiempo en esta personalización, en estar liderando de alguna manera estos encuentros, estas discusiones. Para no perder tanto tiempo, otro asunto, no usar aplicaciones complejas para enfatizar una metodología participativa. Yo sé que todas y todos queremos enfatizar metodologías participativas, pero no las hagamos tan complejas, no usemos aplicaciones tan complejas, porque hay mucho alumnado, sobre todo cuando hay formaciones donde tienes alumnas y alumnos de 15, 20 países, no todo el mundo sabe usar la tecnología de la misma manera. Desarrollar una evaluación, necesitamos unas evaluaciones de Online Gender Assessment, porque es muy importante, necesitamos saber casos de estudio, compartir información, buenas prácticas. Y esto me gustaría decirlo, no hacer negocio en el nombre de la personalización de la formación, porque claro, online es como algo masivo, ¿no? Pero la personalización sí que es verdad que requiere más tiempo, pero intentemos que todas las personas que quieran formarse en género tengan las mismas posibilidades para tener una formación del más alto nivel. Y lo último que querría comentarles, por favor la siguiente, Lucy, es mi experiencia en la formación en turismo género. Esta es una de las formaciones que yo hago y esto sí que ha sido para mí un desafío clave, porque por un lado tenemos todos los desafíos de la capacitación de género propiamente tal, muy tailor-made, pero por otro lado tenemos el turismo. El turismo ha sido una de las industrias más afectadas con la pandemia y esto también ha calado mucho a la hora de enseñar el turismo. Entonces, mi propuesta es que ahora más que nunca tenemos que enseñar un turismo desde un punto de vista crítico, feminista, transformativo. El alumnado espera que se les enseñe esto y sobre todo el alumnado que está invirtiendo dinero en su matrícula para estudiar turismo en medio de la crisis. Es decir, yo creo que hacerles una formación en turismo género desde una perspectiva crítica transformativa les da más sentido del por qué están capacitándose en turismo también. Y lo otro, que la capacitación en género instaurada en la capacitación del turismo ayuda a que el turismo se pueda profesionalizar y que este restablecimiento del turismo sea más lógico con los principales desafíos que hoy por hoy tenemos en todos los ámbitos, no solamente en la capacitación, sino que también, por ejemplo, en el desarrollo sostenible. Y con esto termino y muchas gracias por la invitación.
Hi there. Should I just, oh, Lucy, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I'll just introduce you, Adriana, and then you can share the screen, okay?
Okay.
Adriana has over 15 years of diverse experience as a workplace human rights and employment lawyer, trainer, and facilitator in gender diversity and inclusion, leadership and organizational well-being. She's worked with the UN, universities, and the non-profit and private sectors. She supports organizations to create equitable, inclusive environments and relations through training, policy development, coaching, and communication. So welcome, Adriana.
Thank you. So we're going to do the human thing that happens is trying to share the screen now. So bear with me. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to go from the beginning so that you do not see my notes. And on. Oh my goodness. Hold on, but you do see my notes. Hold on. Okay, let's just see if we can. Does everyone, Lucy, what do you see? Just the slides?
Fine, perfect.
Yeah,
Just the slides,
perfect. The wonders of technology. Awesome. So thanks for that awesome introduction. I'm Adriana, as Lucy said. So I work with ALG Consulting. It's been my calling. I'm really honored to be here today. And I also know we're all going through personal collective crises. So I'm just honored to be among these panelists and actually learning with you today. So I'm an experiential learning by doing facilitator, as many of you know. So I believe it's really important in the work that I do and that we do. So what I'd like to do in my short time today is try to help us experience a little bit of what I'm going to be sharing in terms of facilitator tips in how to manage online inclusive facilitation. So on that note, in my 7 minutes that remain, okay, if you can share in the chat function your names, where you're calling in from, and if you're feeling creative, I encourage you to introduce yourselves with one adjective that starts with the first letter of your first name that you think describes you. One thing I say sometimes, active Adriana, for example. If that's too much because it's too early or too late, just tell us like what the weather is where you are, something to connect us because we're 75 people on the line. And this is something I do a lot to break the ice, so to speak. As we all know, this is important, especially in online trainings. And I'm going to try and look and see what we got here. Ooh, we've got Germany, we've got Toronto, Creative Kara, all right, Lively, Lucy, it's going to keep going. I can't read out 75 names. Know that we're all together and hopefully we can see more. Check out the chat function to see who we have among us and from where. So I do this kind of thing as a trainer in person. It's become essential for me to do it online to build connection, to build trust. As Danielle had mentioned, building trust and building that critical reflection that we need as gender trainers is quite hard online. So we have to adapt our facilitation. Often what I do when I'm doing icebreakers is connect with the content. If I had more time, I would break you into breakout rooms. We'd have a safe space of 4 or 5 people and connect on a deeper level. If I'm dealing with something around, for example, intersectionality in training, I often have people explore different aspects of their identity and introduce themselves that way. So there's various ways to use icebreakers, as many of you know, but I want to emphasize how important they are now in this current context. So just to tell you, I wanted to share my vision. I won't go into details. You can read more about what I do online. Lucy, awesome introduction, but I wanted to share with you the vision, and I use this a lot more during COVID-19, is to remember the vision of why I do it. Safe, inclusive, supportive organizations and relations that empower all women to thrive. Why I wanted to share that with you is because it's been a driving force for me in my work. It's also important that you know the next recommendations I give are a lot more to do with some of the workplace and organizational level change that I do. So I'll be giving a few more context specifics or recommendations around that kind of work I do. All right. Moving on. This is a challenge doing this so quickly. Some of the changes that I've observed from both a process, format, and content perspective in my work are the following. Both Namdi and Daniela articulated some of these changes. Virtual training is different. We learn differently as a trainer. I know that we process information differently online. Trust building is harder online. Communication is harder. Research shows we have a negativity bias when all we can see online in Zoom is our faces and we assume the worst. So you have to just engage differently online. So thinking about your whole being and how you express yourselves for learners is so important online. So I want to hone in on some of those recommendations in a moment. But some of the content that I've had to integrate that I think is important for us to consider going forward, particularly working in organizations, are, as Namdi said, there are so many forms of gender-based violence that we know have skyrocketed. In my line of work, I've been integrating more and more research on domestic violence and looking at employer and organizational level obligations, given how many more people and folks are working from home, what are those new obligations in the new world of work? So that's an area that I'm exploring more, and you'll see some of the work. If you want to, I can share online afterwards some of the work I've been doing on that. Cyber harassment and sexual harassment are areas that I work in, and they're evolving areas that I think we need to keep in mind given the kind of work. Talk a little bit more about that at the end. But I want to share some tips on facilitation. So I want to just generally caveat by saying we know Zoom creates this nervous system response. I've been doing some research on that, where we're all feeling a little bit more on guard. So we just keep that in mind when we're having online trainings. I know that you're not going to feel as connected to me, and it's going to be harder for you to trust me and all of us online. So let's keep that in mind, that new partnerships, new information is going to be harder to absorb, and trust is going to be harder to build. So Daniela very rightly mentioned, when we're thinking about change management in terms of gender equality training, we have to know that building trust is going to be harder. We have to be more mindful of the way we communicate more intentionally online. And as Namdi mentioned, be mindful that our current realities and our current virtual reality exacerbates existing inequalities. You get to see where I live. We all get to see where each other's lives all of a sudden. This is something we have to keep in mind. We also know that often in team meetings, I've seen a lot of different voices get talked over when we're talking online. So as a facilitator, when you're training with 50 different people in the room, keeping in mind who's in the room and when is important. One of the things that I recommend to do that is group agreements. As a facilitator, we all know that we have to do that. Online is so important. Intentionally building agreements of how we create a safe learning environment online, I believe is essential in the trainings that we do. 2, check-ins. A facilitator must do. I'm not walking the talk now. Normally I check in to see if you're getting what I'm saying with a yes, down, thumbs up, thumbs down emoji. That said, I'd encourage you to do that kind of a thing. Take a temperature read of when people need breaks. Create communication guidelines of how to show who needs a break when and who wants to speak when. These kinds of things are important. And I saw that online people also talked about checking in beforehand to get to know your participants with, say, a survey before, to be able to tailor the training to their needs. That's also important. Clarity, can't overemphasize, I think Daniela mentioned this, how important it is online. I've noticed that when I do breakout rooms or role plays, for example, people need a lot more clarity and repetition of instructions. So these are pragmatic instructions. As a facilitator, we need to remember to go slower. I also have to remember that. I get very excitable. To also repeat instructions. You may need to, for accommodation, send information beforehand, like a high-level overview in advance for people who process information differently. So keeping in mind neurodivergent peoples and different kind of peoples, we need to have more clarity and intentional, shorter directive communication online. Inclusive engagement, it's a broad term, but I'm thinking more about participation that manifests differently with different cultures, genders, time zones online. So noticing who is speaking when and how, taking turns more intentionally on who speaks how and when, especially in team meetings. And maybe one thing I've tried is assigning devil's advocate to different people on the team and rotate that so we can surface disagreement in a more intentional, safer way, because different cultures and power dynamics make it so online people may be less safe to speak up and surface disagreement. So these are some practical facilitator tools. I also like to try and use visuals when I can and get a little bit more creative. As you see, I tried to get a little bit more creative to spice things up, keep engagement going, and also create alternatives for people processing information differently. We tend to be verbal, some of us who are working with expertise or doing research, and we tend to write a lot. I do. That's not everybody's way of processing, and online that can be exacerbated for different folks. So thinking about different ways to convey information is good. I've been trying to get creative with movement as well sometimes with embodiment practices, but I'm also mindful that that doesn't work for everyone and that there's people with different mobility issues. So figuring out different strategies that work for everyone. I've also tried drawing. It might sound a little bit outside the box for some people, but when we're talking about concepts like collaboration, for example, I've tried to have participants draw what they experience as collaboration and share it. And that's sort of a different way of accessing a different cognitive inside of your brain, but to really absorb the information in a short amount of time in a different way. So these are some strategies. There's more we could talk about, but those are some creative strategies. Generally, there's some, I wrote too soon. Okay, so online tools, we know a lot of them that I've mentioned. I just wanted to put them out there in a more practical way. Of course, Zoom is our, I have a love-hate relationship with Zoom at this point. I've been using it a lot. Other tools that I wanted to give a shout out to that I've been using with some UN clients actually are collaboration software. Google Docs, of course, is my best friend and everyone's best friend. Miro and Padlet are two tools that I think some UN women training people, so I've actually learned about Miro from one training here before. And it's a really good tool to try to use for strategic planning sessions, gender equality training sessions. There's a lot of different templates you can use. You can use Post-its. So I've actually mirrored doing Post-its and thematically, grouping together different themes on Post-its with Miro. Padlet's a very creative software you can try. Thanks, Lucy. I'm almost done. Thanks for the shout out. So those are a few that I wanted to just give a shout out to. Another one is online teaching, a platform called Teachable. As Daniela mentioned, transferring what you do in person to online is, in French, not easy at all. So some of these tools I've been experimenting with myself as a trainer. Teachable is one that I recommend giving a try to because it actually helps to structure an online training. It has a certification at the end, and you have to structure materials differently too, as Daniela was saying. So it helps you find a way to kind of do pre-material surveys, integrate it all and structure it online. So trying to find these different platforms and see what works. Emphasizing, of course, that as a trainer, the most important thing for me is the learning, engagement, and the learning objective. So I don't just add fancy tools to add fancy tools, which many people make the mistake of doing. I myself have done that. It's really about what tool would best help further the learning objectives given the time you've got online. Okay. So last but not least, these are some recommendations and areas that I'm exploring in my work in organizations in terms of training content. Virtual facilitation skills, we spoke about that. Leaders have been asking, how do I facilitate meetings online? How do I facilitate trainings online? We spoke a bit about that. Cross-cultural communication for me, working with global teams, has become really important, given that a lot of teams are now working with people from around the world, different time zones, different genders, different environments and cultures. So really learning how to intentionally communicate and have group guidelines online in different cultures has become really important, particularly with sensitive topics like, say, gender-based harassment in the workplace. I've really had to be intentional about communicating with different people online. Gender-based violence, as Namdi had said, I'm working a lot more on intimate partner violence and domestic violence and employer and obligations of organizations. It's a gray zone. It's a zone that I'm actually working more towards and pushing where those obligations are actually shifting as we speak and integrating that into some of the work that I do. Intersectionality, we can't stress enough. With Black Lives Matter, there's been a lot of a reckoning in North America and around the world. That said, obviously intersectionality is going to look different in the different contexts you work. I believe this whole movement is going to have to radically shift the way that often many of us think about gender justice. There can be no gender justice without racial justice. And that's something that I've been reckoning with and thinking about when I want to create space for all women, cis, trans, women of all different backgrounds in the trainings I do. It's an ongoing process of learning. And last but not least, a passionate area of mine as a passion is prevention of sexual harassment, exploitation, and abuse. A lot of organizations are working on this, including the UN, I know. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations have also put this on the back burner given the crises in COVID. What I know, and from research I am seeing, is that crises including workplace violence does increase in times of crises. So I've been seeing research on sexual harassment, cyber harassment increasing. There's a lack of boundaries in terms of the workplace. So you see some sexual harassment happening online as well. So let's keep that in mind. I'm at the end of my time, so I'm going to say, I'll leave you with a quote from Grace Lee Boggs, American author, feminist, philosopher. Transform yourself to transform the world. That is more important than ever in the work that we do now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for managing to get so much content into your presentation. Thank you. And I'm now very pleased to introduce our final speaker, Álvaro Campos, who will also be speaking in Spanish. Álvaro is the president of the Instituto WEM, the Costa Rican Institute of Masculinity, Couples and Sexuality, which is the country's focal organization for the global Men Engage Alliance and the international White Ribbon Campaign to prevent violence against women. Álvaro leads and coordinates Latin America's regional Men Engage network and has been heavily involved in working with men and boys during the COVID-19 pandemic to address issues of domestic violence and sexuality. So I'm pleased to pass the screen control to you, Álvaro. Bienvenido y muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Muchas gracias y es un honor para mí haber sido invitado por unas mujeres a esta actividad. Voy a compartir pantalla. Y bueno, yo procedo de una organización no gubernamental en Costa Rica que se llama Instituto WEM. WEM significa hombre en un vocablo de un pueblo originario, que es los Bribri. Y trabajamos con hombres, adolescentes y adultos para un cambio cultural hacia la igualdad, la prevención de la violencia masculina y la promoción de masculinidades igualitarias y positivas, con una visión aliada al movimiento de mujeres, aliado también al movimiento de diversidad sexual y a los derechos humanos. Tenemos dos grandes áreas, Buen Joven, que incluye adolescentes y adultos jóvenes, y Buen Adultos, que incluye adultos y adultos mayores. Los procesos educativos de sensibilización y capacitación con hombres son uno de los ejes centrales del Instituto WEM. Nosotros trabajamos con grupos de terapia para hombres, con talleres a nivel comunitario, con proyectos comunitarios. También formamos redes de hombres en la comunidad, igual para la prevención de la violencia. ¿Cómo ha afectado la pandemia? Bueno, con la pandemia, las situaciones de crisis de los hombres se han agudizado por la inseguridad económica, la incertidumbre, la ansiedad, el desempleo o mayor permanencia en la casa. Y esto ha hecho que se incrementen índices de violencia hacia las mujeres, hacia los niños y niñas. Los hombres se estresan y convierten el estrés en violencia hacia las mujeres, hacia los niños y hacia las niñas. ¿Verdad? No digo que todos, pero sí una buena cantidad de hombres. Los hombres se tornan inseguros y convierten esto en violencia también. Antes de la pandemia, estábamos acostumbrados a que la capacitación fuera presencial. Pero con la pandemia esto ha cambiado. Hemos tenido que innovar nuevas metodologías. Usar plataformas como Zoom o Teams. No usábamos estas plataformas. Es más, muchos ni siquiera sabíamos cómo se usaban. Uso de webinares, Facebook Live, elaboración de infografías, videos para presentar por las redes sociales. Hemos tenido que aprender a dar talleres a través de las redes, hasta terapia de grupo por Zoom. Y todo eso ha sido nuevo para nosotros. Mesas redondas, conversatorios temáticos y la cantidad de materiales ha sido abundante, tanto en Costa Rica como en el resto de América Latina. En Costa Rica, en el Instituto WEN, hemos producido muchísimo material, pero también en el resto de América Latina. Esto ha estimulado la creatividad y la producción. Se ha logrado participación multipaís también en estas actividades. Por ejemplo, hemos dado talleres en Costa Rica para compañeros de México, de Honduras y de Costa Rica. También se implementó una campaña que la voy a mencionar. Yo me apunto a cuidarnos, porque es de Naciones Unidas, del PNUD y el Instituto WEN de Costa Rica. Y tanto jóvenes y adultos han producido materiales, lo cual esto también nos ha llamado mucho la atención. Ejemplos de algunos de los materiales producidos. Acá tenemos la campaña durante el Quédate en Casa, yo me apunto a cuidarnos, que es una campaña de Naciones Unidas apoyada por una serie de organizaciones en Costa Rica. Esa campaña consistió en videos, materiales audiovisuales que se repartían, que sirvieron como material educativo para dar a conocer la temática y sobre todo para prevenir la violencia durante el COVID principalmente. Acá tenemos algunos de esos materiales. Por ejemplo, infografías como las siguientes: el enojo en los hombres, con tips muy concretos sobre cómo manejarlo. Nos hemos dado cuenta que los hombres necesitan herramientas para prevención de la violencia. Que yo quiero prevenir violencia, pero ¿cómo lo hago? Necesito saber el cómo. Esto es, por ejemplo, un Facebook Live. Tienes conductas de riesgo, evitemos la ira y violencia en casa. Hicimos varios Facebook Live. También trabajamos la corresponsabilidad, porque los hombres se quedan en la casa, pero haciendo nada. O sea, la idea es que se queden y que se hagan responsables del cuidado, ¿verdad? Entonces tuvimos que trabajar varios videos y varios fiches en ese sentido también. Acá tenemos otros: el enojo en los hombres, manejo del enojo para hombres, manejo del enojo para hombres jóvenes, incluidos adolescentes también. Y bueno, no solamente la campaña, también durante este periodo se organizó el tercer simposio mundial de masculinidades, que tenía la sede en Ruanda. Originalmente iba a ser en Ruanda. Se llama Ubuntu. Ubuntu es un vocablo que significa solo puedo ser yo si tú existes. O sea, es una situación de respeto. Todo el simposio se realizó de manera virtual. Es más, se sigue realizando porque es un simposio que se prolonga por varios meses. Y tuvimos una sede en América Latina para este simposio también en Uruguay. Esto produjo muchísimo material también. Aquí tenemos algunos ejemplos. Vean, multipaís, que participaban diversos: México, Colombia, Chile, Brasil, en una sola presentación. Acá tenemos, vean qué interesante cómo nos enamoramos, un webinar de los jóvenes. Es para hablar del amor romántico adolescente, ¿verdad? Etcétera. También tuvimos que anunciar grupos de apoyo para hombres online. Aquí pongo ejemplos de 2 grupos, ¿verdad?, para que trabajen y como un instrumento de prevención de la violencia. Acá tenemos otro: masculinidades en la juventud y adolescencia, y una gran cantidad de materiales. Ahora bien, ¿cuáles son los desafíos? Vencer la resistencia que la mayoría de personas capacitadoras tienen en el uso de las tecnologías de información y comunicación. Las personas capacitadoras han tenido que capacitarse, ¿verdad? Ahora, ¿cómo incluir eventos culturales educativos a través de las plataformas? Los hemos incluido y hemos puesto desde teatro, música en general. ¿Cómo lograr la participación de las personas, tanto expositoras como usuarias? ¿Qué lecciones hemos aprendido? Se pueden lograr procesos educativos por la vía virtual. Y es posible trabajar revisión de actitudes personales y hasta procesos de terapia con hombres por la vía virtual. Se pueden llevar a cabo campañas Se multiplicó la cantidad de actividades y modalidades metodológicas, se logra mucha participación de la población usuaria, la mayoría de actividades pueden grabarse y estar disponibles para que la gente las vea después. O sea, la modalidad presencial es importante, pero no es la única forma de lograr una capacitación efectiva. Sin embargo, como decía una de las compañeras, la parte vivencial es muy difícil lograr online. Se puede tratar y hemos logrado algo, pero no se logra tan abiertamente como la parte, y es que los temas de género pasan por lo personal, no basta la información. Esa es la gran limitación que tenemos. ¿Qué recomendaciones damos a futuro? Desarrollar procesos de capacitación dirigidos al personal capacitador. Tenemos que aprender otras formas, aprender animación virtual, aprender a hacer videos bonitos, virtuales, etc. Porque yo soy psicólogo, no soy experto en hacer estas cosas. O sea, entonces necesitamos capacitación. Mejorar el acceso a Internet en diferentes países y sus regiones. Hay países y hay regiones que no tienen acceso a Internet o que los hombres no tienen esa posibilidad de conectarse. En Costa Rica pues tenemos un acceso bastante grande del Internet, pero estoy hablando a nivel regional, es necesario, esa es una limitación. Diseñar cursos virtuales, ya cursos completos a nivel virtual, que no sea solo el PowerPoint, que no sea solo que el Facebook Live, un curso completo virtual. Y continuar con la estrategia de capacitación, aunque pase la pandemia del COVID. O sea, la capacitación virtual vino para quedarse, se va a quedar entre nosotros, aunque pase el COVID. Ahora, en nuestro caso, ¿cuál es el gran reto? ¿Cómo incorporamos a los hombres en este proceso? Para que se interesen, para que prevengan violencia hacia las mujeres, para que construyan igualdad, para que aprendamos a cuidar a las mujeres, a los hombres, a los niños, a las niñas, a los animales, al planeta. ¿Cómo incorporamos a los hombres? Ese es el gran reto. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti, Álvaro. Ha sido súper interesante la presentación. I think we've had 4 extremely rich presentations from different perspectives, and they've all allowed for us to have a really good reflection on the topics. So we have a range of questions here. Rui is sharing the questions with us so that we can see them. In any case, what I will do is read them out. Is that the number of questions, Ria?
This is all we've gotten so far.
Right, that's perfect.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do is read the 7, and then if each of the speakers can take the notes, please, and then I'll ask each speaker to answer the questions which they think are most relevant to them. So can one of you speak to more affordable and accessible virtual training methodologies for training? That's from Prabha. What kind of content are you delivering training now on that you weren't before COVID-19? Very interesting, from Gwen. ¿Tienen tips de cómo asegurar la privacidad de la gente que atiende un webinario? Por ejemplo, si grabamos las sesiones, quedan en la red y quizá no para todos es seguro. So that's from Martina. So do you have any tips on how to ensure the privacy of people who are attending a webinar? For example, what happens to recorded sessions? From Michael, how do you deal with Zoom fatigue? ¿Cómo se actúa con la fatiga de Zoom? No sé, ¿cómo se actúa contra esto? From Leila, does anyone have examples of good online gender assessments they've seen that access digital accessibility and literacy? Excellent question. Si tenéis algún ejemplo de algún cuestionario online sobre la accesibilidad digital y la literacia digital, diría, digital literacy. And from Sabine, how do you think the media could improve women's conditions in underdeveloped countries, and how could schools teach children, especially young boys, about creating a gender equal environment in the future? That's maybe specifically for Álvaro, from Sabine. ¿Cómo pueden las medidas mejorar las condiciones de las mujeres, y además cómo podrían los escolares enseñar a los niños jóvenes sobre la igualdad de género. And finally, Daniela, pues específicamente para ti, en cuanto a la actividad formadora, investigativa e innovadora, ¿cuáles han sido los pros y contras? ¿Hay acciones que han sido posibles vía remota en los países donde has mencionado? And there's Roberta, thank you for the English translation as well. So I'm going to ask each presenter to perhaps answer 2 questions. So if you could each choose the 2 questions that are most relevant to you, I think that would be the most effective way. So we will start in the same order that we had the presentation. So Namdi, we would love to hear from you again, please. I think your presentation was greatly appreciated. There were lots of comments in the chat thanking you. So which questions would you like to respond to?
I would like to respond to question 4 and 6, although I see a couple of questions still coming in that I may like to respond to that before later. So on how do you deal with Zoom fatigue? The truth is, as facilitators, we also have Zoom fatigue, I must tell you. And like one of the presenters suggested, is to keep your presentation short and as engaging as possible. But we know that we have to do a lot of work when it comes to maintaining concentration of those who you're training or your trainees, but make your presentation as engaging as nice. It should be visually aesthetic. That could help. And you could speak slower. You can imagine that for a presentation like this, we had to rush through it, which is also the question you're asking. It's a learning process, but like have been mentioned severally, if you take some time to learn about virtual presentation, perhaps you could see 1 or 2 tips on how to make, how to deal with Zoom fatigue, I would say. The question 6 is, how do you think the media can improve? Yes, the media has a lot of influence in swaying public opinion, and what information is put out there is quite important to how effective the work you're doing as a gender trainer is. I'm going to give a clear example, especially now that we have COVID. At a point, there were a lot of information flying about concerning how to deal with COVID. People really didn't understand the virus. There were, I would say, too early research conducted. This wasn't validated, but there was a point where research came out that the COVID affected men more. So women felt that they were safer and went about not observing precautionary rules, especially in developing countries. So it sort of led to a spike in infection rate among women. So I would say also train the media when you're training gender facilitators. It is important that the media, like I had mentioned earlier, we do not work in silos as gender facilitators, but we try to carry everyone along, because at the end, you want pedagogical examples or your pedagogies to be disseminated to as large a population as possible. So please always work with the media, engage them in training, individual trainings, engage them for a point of perhaps improvement for next time. Perhaps there should be a media personnel or a media representative in a training like this. It's really helpful.
Thanks very much, Nandi. Yes, very interesting point about the media training, because we don't necessarily have media training. It's another thing we need to learn. So many more skills we need to take up. So I will pass to the next presenter, who was Daniela.
Sí, aquí estoy. Voy a elegir, bueno, la 7 está clara que es para mí, voy a elegir la pregunta número 1. Yo creo que ahora, por ejemplo, cuando estaba preparando la presentación, claro, estamos más concentrados en la formación para alumnado que se matricula en un curso específico, pero también en la capacitación de género, por ejemplo, está, yo pienso, ¿no?, en lo que hago en las misiones, que a veces me toca ir para emprendedoras en países pobres, por ejemplo, en países en desarrollo. Ahí yo creo que para garantizar el acceso a una capacitación virtual y de género sobre todo, yo creo que los análisis de los contextos, en este caso, por ejemplo, de un grupo de emprendedoras, va a ser muy importante hacerlo para poder ver si tienen acceso o no a todos los recursos que se requieren de cara a una capacitación de género, por ejemplo, en cuanto a infraestructura, acceso a Internet, conocimiento de Internet, transporte e incluso alimentación, porque mucha gente en muchas formaciones que hacemos presencial, y esto es verdad, van ahí porque también tienen una posibilidad de comer. Así de cruda es la realidad en algunos sitios. Entonces yo creo que la capacitación de género online va a tener que tener en cuenta estos análisis de los contextos, y para hacerlo y para que todo el mundo también, yendo al otro lado, a la gente que se matricule, que a lo mejor requiere ayuda específica, yo creo que tendríamos que tener más presupuestos para avanzar con las capacitaciones de género. Se deberían abrir líneas específicas de financiación, porque también la capacitación de género se puede llevar a cabo teniendo en cuenta muchos niveles, institucional, a partir de la sociedad civil o de una universidad. Es decir, la capacitación de género de por sí es muy diversa y tiene muchas posibilidades. Y yo creo que por ahí, esa sería mi respuesta para la pregunta número 1, pero sí que es verdad también que esto es algo que está evolving, como se dice en inglés, es algo que todavía no tenemos la certeza, cómo vamos a estar de aquí a 6 meses, o sea, planificar la vida ya de por sí con la pandemia es muy complejo, entonces planificar lo que va a pasar de aquí a mediano o largo plazo en la capacitación de género, yo creo que también es un desafío muy importante que hay que tener en cuenta. Y en relación a la pregunta número 7, gracias por la pregunta, porque Latinoamérica, vamos, es mi sitio también de expertise. Yo creo que en la actividad formadora, como les dije en la formación, hubo un cambio radical en la agenda de investigación de género, y en Latinoamérica también lo hubo, o sea, en el sentido, o sea, la violencia de género y las cargas de trabajo que muchas veces asumimos las mujeres en Latinoamérica, la carga de trabajo laboral, doméstica de cuidado es muy alta, pero a raíz de la COVID-19 esto empeoró y empeoró mucho más en Latinoamérica. No olvidemos que Latinoamérica es una de las regiones más violentas contra las mujeres del mundo. Entonces sí que es verdad que en la actividad formadora investigativa se abrieron estas líneas de investigación que siempre han estado abiertas, pero ahora muy vinculadas con la COVID-19. También en Latinoamérica lo que pasó es que se cambió las prioridades a la hora del interés por investigar cierto contenido. Por ejemplo, ahora hay una prioridad en todo lo que es la economía informal, en el ámbito de la salud también, y también en el ámbito del comercio y género, porque ahora como se quiere reactivar la economía latinoamericana, hay un foco en todo el tema de lo que es cadena de valor y género conectado a distintos temas de Latinoamérica. Y no es porque yo sea experta en turismo género, pero las cadenas de valor turísticas de un enfoque de género están teniendo protagonismo ahora en Latinoamérica porque se quiere reactivar el sector propiamente tal. Entonces ahí viene todo el tema de la investigación, y si quieres que te dé algún ejemplo muy concreto, tengo 2, los cuales estoy trabajando con ellos ahora. El primero es una investigación en Centroamérica que lleva 1 año y medio de desarrollo, hace 2 años y medio que se empezó a hacer de manera presencial con salidas a terreno, y lógicamente vino la pandemia y se tuvo que rehacer todo el proyecto de investigación, es decir, toda la metodología de recolección de datos se tuvo que cambiar y adecuar a la situación que estamos viviendo hoy en día, y eso también hizo que los objetivos del proyecto fueran mucho más adecuados al contexto que estamos viviendo hoy en día, y el presupuesto también. Y lo otro es hace poco una investigación precisamente en Perú sobre economía informal, que lo empezamos a hacer desde el primer momento, lógicamente empezó hace 6 meses, teniendo en cuenta la situación online. Entonces, por ejemplo, todas las entrevistas se están haciendo online, y es realmente un desafío, porque claro, entrevistar a personas que están trabajando en la economía informal y que están pasándola bastante mal, hay como menos cercanía a la hora de hacerlo online. Entonces uno de los tips que hicimos fue contratar personal de investigación nacional que también podría darle apoyo en caso de necesitarlo a las personas que hemos entrevistado. Entonces esa sería mi respuesta para la pregunta número 7.
Muchas gracias, Daniela. Thank you. Sorry we don't have simultaneous translation. I'm not going to try and summarize the answer except to say that we need to pay attention to incentives for training, because as Daniela was saying, often working in poorer communities, for example, providing transportation and food for the event would be an incentive. So how do we have those kinds of incentives in online scenarios? And then finally, maybe there are some advantages of what's happened with the new situation, because we've had to adjust our budgets and our possibilities, and perhaps we're hiring more local trainers and local consultants than sending necessarily someone from the other side of the world. So that's a very brief summary. So I'll now pass to Adriana to address one or two of the questions that you think are relevant to you. I just want to be clear that the idea was to close at 5, but if it's but if it's okay, we'd allow the last 2 speakers to speak. So we'll continue for another 10 to 15 minutes. If you need to leave now, then of course that's understandable, and we thank you for being here. If you're able to stay, we'll continue for another 15 minutes. Okay, thank you, Adriana.
Oh, thanks. I think I'll briefly just add to Namdi's thoughts on the Zoom fatigue question, because I think I have a few suggestions, and I'll answer the question on the new kinds of content, question 2. So I'll start with Zoom fatigue. So Namdi raised some good points. Like I mentioned in my presentation, and I hope we'll be able to share them with participants, but some of the things that I've been doing for Zoom fatigue for myself, like Namdi mentioned, as well as for the participants, is break time. For sure, integrating break much more intentionally throughout presentations is really important. Naming the fatigue, having spaces for people to actually say that they need more than one break. So these things are important, like creating human, needs like bio breaks, like time for being human online, right? Being more creative and versatile with what kinds of formats we use. Alvaro, I think, touched on that a little bit too, to really touch on the sort of touching on a human level and getting people to be more engaged visually, et cetera. And also creating some kinds of movements. I've experimented with that, with the caveat that I want to make sure people are comfortable or not with different kinds of movement activities, but I integrate that, and I do integrate music, context-specific music, and different kinds of things like that, different modalities that kind of raise the spirits and actually engage a different side of the brain for people. So those are different things that I've been doing that seem to work on Zoom, as well as breaks and shortening the training and the content. And it's, as Andy said, it's like a learning as we go kind of a thing, but it's just important to name it first and foremost and keep remembering that this is the reality that we're living in. So that's the first question. The second one is about content. Given that I work a lot in the organizational context, I have some specific areas that I've been exploring. One of them, as I mentioned, was cross-cultural communication. Even in this particular presentation, we've got different time zones of the panelists on the line. We've got different cultures. We've got a lot more of that happening. So I think intentionally I've had to integrate and have requests to integrate more of online cultural communication strategies, how to surface conflict, nonverbal communication, assertive and respectful communication guidelines. These are things I've had to integrate into some of my building a culture of respect workshops, for example, with different organizations that are now working cross-culturally with a lot more people across the world. So that's one of them. Also, I've talked a lot about domestic violence, more than I had before, given that I am examining myself, working in the workplace, employer and organizational responsibilities for folks working from home and increased rates of domestic violence. So that's something that I've been integrating into some of the workplace harassment and workplace safety trainings that I've been looking at. On the note on workplace safety, I've been looking a lot more broadly at psychological health and safety. And in Canada, we've been talking a lot more about how to integrate a gender perspective, an intersectional gender perspective into that, considering that in COVID, I've seen various rates of burnout for women in Canada and around the world for, taking double, triple duty, caretakers working full time. There's a lot of burnout happening with women, and there's an intersectional perspective here, especially with a lot of us talking about different anti-racist policies being integrated into workplaces. There's been a lot of, trauma that a lot of workers of color, Black people, Indigenous people have been re-experiencing in their workplaces. So we've had to kind of add that, and I've been thinking about how to add that and understand that well-being and psychological safety component is really important in the kinds of trainings that I've been doing.
Thank you, Adriana. Very complete responses and really interesting. Managed to get lots of great points in there. So thank you very much. So I will finally turn to Álvaro. Álvaro, te voy a invitar a contestar la pregunta que te parece más interesante o más relevante y bueno, te paso la palabra.
Sí, tal vez dos cosas. Resaltar el tema de la fatiga. Las capacitaciones hemos tenido que modificarlas. Ya no son talleres de 4 horas o de 6 horas. Tenemos que hacer todo en 1 hora o en 2 horas. Entonces eso nos obliga a cambiar la metodología, desarrollar contenidos, porque si usted tiene sentado a un grupo de personas 4 horas, 5 horas, no logra el efecto. La gente se cansa demasiado. La otra tiene que ver con la confidencialidad de la información. Es cierto que podemos tocar cosas personales, pero la gente se cuida mucho cuando es en línea. ¿Cómo voy a compartir lo que estoy haciendo? En el caso de nosotros, cuando trabajamos con hombres, es muy importante que el hombre diga que es agresor si está agrediendo, pero ¿cómo lo va a hacer en línea? Y me imagino que igual con las mujeres, ¿con qué confianza una mujer va a decir en línea, miren, es que yo estoy recibiendo violencia? O sea, yo creo que hay una parte aquí que es ética y de seguridad y protección, que si bien es cierto, trae maravillas este asunto de la capacitación en línea, pero hay cosas que definitivamente no se pueden dar en línea porque no podemos garantizar esa confidencialidad, sería lo único. Sin embargo, creo que aprendamos de esto y saquémosle el mayor provecho, que es lo que estamos haciendo. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti y por la brevedad. Y thank you for a really interesting contribution. The point is that because we can't always necessarily guarantee safety or confidentiality, anonymity, maybe there are some things that we simply aren't able to deal with in these kinds of online settings. I think that's very wise to close on. And I just wanted to add one reflection for us, please, as a community of gender equality trainers. And it's very interesting to me that the first question was, how has life changed or how has things changed for trainers in the pandemic? And nobody's spoken about themselves, which is because everybody's so focused on the topic and the subject that we're working on and the methodologies and how we can reach our goals. But I would also like us to reflect on how it's affected our lives personally, because we are also living in a pandemic. We're not outside of the pandemic. So I would encourage us, as well as to continue to fight for our cause and our various causes, that we also think about how we can support each other in the ways that we need psychologically, emotionally, to be able to continue to do this work, and also acknowledge, as one of the presenters said, our own Zoom fatigue and general fatigue, and maybe even be honest and call it exhaustion. So let's look after each other as well, and therefore we will be stronger to fight the fight together. I will pass now to Ruya just to close on the final points of where we go from here. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Lucy, and thank you to everyone, to Nambi, to Daniela, to Adriana, for your amazing presentations, Lucy for your amazing moderation, and to all of you who have sent in such great comments, questions, and everything. You can see on your screen that we're going to prepare a final report based on all the discussions. We're going to credit all of you. And I would really encourage you, as Lucy said, like, we need spaces in which we can just, reflect and talk and maybe not have to connect on Zoom. So I would really encourage you all to go to the COP platform. You can see the website on your screens right now. I'd encourage you to go there and just post your thoughts. And I'm going to post all of the questions that we didn't get to today. And I'd encourage the panelists as well to go and look at the forum and reply, and to all of you in the audience to also do so. And so thank you all very, very much for being with us today. And I release you into the world so that you don't have to stare at your computer screens anymore. So we wish you all a wonderful day, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.